Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Movie Pit Podcast. It's our 8th anniversary. 8 years. Wow. 8 years. I never thought I'd get to this point. Honestly, not a lot of podcasts get to this point, let alone a podcast with only one person. But here I am. So I'll take the win. I'll take that. That's not something to frown upon. I originally wanted to do something different. I had a couple of ideas, which I mentioned on the socials, but timing is everything, and I misjudged my time, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to do what I originally wanted, but you gotta adapt, right? So I'm going to turn this into a retrospective. How did I get here? Is the podcast what I wanted? And where do I see the podcast really going? Because let me tell you, my opinion has changed since I asked that question earlier this year. So where did the podcast come from? I originally did YouTube videos. I think if you go to the YouTube channel, go back far back enough, you'll see them. Don't do that because they are not good whatsoever. But it was nothing fancy. Again, please don't go back and look at them. It was me and a plug-in webcam with Movie Maker as my editing tool. And I did what I'm doing now, talking about the movie news, reviewing some movies, and the occasional kind of special video here and there. That transformed in when I got to college, community college. I went to community college first, and I had a radio show there, first called Movies 101, my first semester that we did the show. Second semester we did the show, it was Movies 102, and then finally it became the Movie Pit. Again, talking about movies, trailers, the weekly releases, and sometimes, not all the time, reviews. I didn't really do a lot of reviews on the show. It was a lot of movie news and stuff like that. And then when I moved on to university, I left the radio show and focused on my studies. It wasn't until my last semester, or maybe even my second to last semester, when I personally started listening to podcasts. And I wanted to do one of my own. I wanted to start one of my own because, I had done the YouTube video thing. I had done, the radio show thing. And I had put, a few the radio clips on the YouTube channel to kind of, make it seem like it was a kind of pretty much like it was a podcast. And I even talked about it with some of my classmates I got close with, and we were planning stuff out. And when we were doing that, I knew that it would be a bit too much. I didn't have, really any money at the time. All the money that I either saved up or was making all went to paying for college. And I didn't have a real place to record, and everything, again, at the time was just ideas. So fast forward, I graduated, and I got a mic. It was a kind of, pretty much a starter mic, if you will, a Blue Snowball. And one day I had the house to myself, and I said, screw it. Let's record, and thus the podcast was born. And we're in currently the Oscar season, and when I did that first show, it was an Oscar predictions podcast. And originally the podcast was only on YouTube. I didn't know a damn thing about putting the podcast on any kind of podcatcher. I didn't know how to create an RSS feed. Nothing. I was a blank dumb fool for that. And I didn't even have a logo. I used Paint or whatever it was, and I just used text and gave for every week I created a new logo. Basically, quote unquote logo. So it wasn't until I got, a good groove going where I really started to think about putting the podcast on, some sort of podcatcher. Apple Podcast was at the time my go-to because that's where I was listening to my podcast at the time. So 100 episodes in to the podcast, I finally put it on Apple Podcast, and, then went down the line of all the other podcatchers out there, and the rest is kind of history. So the next question is, because of that, you kind of, the way I was kind of putting it, is this what I wanted for the podcast? Sort of. There were a lot of big ideas for the podcast originally that I knew I couldn't do. I had a very ambitious and not, in hindsight, not feasibly possible plan for the podcast. I wanted the audio, I wanted the video component, which just meant more editing for me, but I didn't realize that at the time. But I was a dreamer. I was. And if you couldn't believe in yourself, then why do it? So I was okay with the podcast being only audio at the time. I had plans to maybe do, 1 or 2 video podcasts, but that didn't happen. And it still hasn't happened, even though I have the equipment and everything that I need to do it. So I like the podcast only being audio. I do. I'm fine with it. I've always talked about this, that I do wish I had a co-host. Doesn't even need to be the same person. If I had a revolving door co-host, I would have been and have been okay with that, because at one point I did have someone kind of here with me and kind of sending in audio clips of him kind of talking about the news, and I would just put them into the podcast. His name was Mike. I haven't heard from Mike in a while. He went off and did his own thing. We didn't have a falling out. He just went off and did his own thing. And I've had people on the podcast. This was all pre-pandemic. COVID wasn't even a glimmer in whatever sort of crazy, eye the world had for us yet. But this podcast has pretty much always just been me talking to the void of the internet. And I've made, some podcast connections through this, but I'm such a wimp to ask them to be on my little podcast. So if you're listening to this, if you're wondering why I've never asked you to be on the podcast, because I'm too much of a wimp to ask you. But that's going to change. I promise. And I don't want to come off as desperate or annoying or anything like that. Which is why, again, another reason probably why the podcast took so long to be on any sort of other podcatcher. But yeah, I had a lot of ambitious plans for this podcast. And there was a lot of podcasts that I was listening to back in the day that I was like, that's what I want my podcast to be. And I couldn't do that. And a majority of that was because I needed someone else with me. But I figured out kind of sort of a way to do it by myself. But again, it just kind of was too ambitious at the time for me to do that. So the next question, where do I see the podcast really going? I talked about this on another podcast that I did called Conversation. And I mentioned on that podcast that I had thought about ending the podcast multiple times for whatever, reason I had. I thought about ending the podcast 4 years ago. So really right before the pandemic started. I even thought about ending the podcast 2 years ago. And my thought process, every kind of year when the year started and when I wanted to end the podcast was I'm still kind of enjoying it. And at this point now, I have this thought process of as long as I'm enjoying doing this, I'm going to keep it going. But obviously that thought of just stopping has crossed my mind. And when I did that first podcast of the year this year, I told all of you that listened that I didn't want to do what I used to do, which was put out half-ass podcasts. I didn't want to put out a podcast where, I joke that, this podcast is half-assed or anything like that. But I think that some of that is humorous. I hope some of that is humorous. But I know that I don't want to put out a podcast where I know I'm phoning it in, because that's not fair to you who takes time to, listen to the podcast, whether it's on normal speed, whether it's on double speed, whether you only, you look at the timestamps and only hear certain parts of the podcast. That's not fair to you. And those podcasts are always really rough to edit, and they take longer than usual because I just know that I'm phoning it in and I'm just trimming it down as much as possible. And because of that, I've changed ever so slightly the format of the podcast. I used to talk about, a lot more movie news, a lot of smaller movie news items. I've pretty much gotten rid of that. I talked about all of the trailers that came out this week. I've trimmed that down to only, showing one or maybe two, or talking about, rather. Trimming the fat has really helped. And I still need to do better. I still need to get more podcasts out. I'm here talking about the 8th anniversary, and I recently did my 300th episode of Movie News Roundup podcast. So the milestones are not lost on me. Trust me. I truly know, and I celebrate those milestones. Those milestones are not easy to come by on a podcast, especially a one-person podcast. But there's always room for improvement. There is always room for improvement. And a good reason I haven't stopped is because of some of those podcasts that I've discovered within, the last 5 years now with the anniversary. Oh, that's 4 years. That doesn't make sense. 4 years. And seeing and hearing them have fun, it reignited me and my passion for talking about movies. I've been lucky to be a part of those podcasts. I mentioned Conversations, 3 Films and a Podcast, which is, has rebranded now to Unsung Gems. I think some of you maybe have discovered me and the podcast through them. And I'm always thankful this is your shout out, guys. If you're even listening to this podcast, if you are, then great. This is your shout out to you guys for helping me out. And, of course, other podcasts along the way. I just mentioned them because I've been on their podcast. So I'm not stopping anytime soon. But that 10-year mark is coming up real fast. And depending on how things play out, I want to be honest with you guys. I don't know. 10 years is a good thing. To 10, not a lot of people make it to 10 years either. So I'm not saying I'm going to stop at 10 years. Like I said, I've kind of changed everything, how the podcast is going, and I've really liked it. I'm doing, more review. I'm trying to do more reviews now, and I'm having fun again. I'm genuinely having fun again doing this podcast. I know earlier last year, I had my emergency surgery, and that just messed me up. And I talked about that in the first podcast of the year. That surgery, that emergency surgery, and the recovering process and everything else afterwards just messed me up. And, both physically and mentally, it drained me. It drained me in a way I didn't think it would be possible. And because of that, I felt like I was on a roll. And then, in comes, life and tells you, nope, no, you're not. But like I said, I'm not stopping anytime soon. I've found I found my second wind, if you will, or my third wind or fourth wind, however many winds it is. How many times I've wanted to stop this podcast. So all in all, I have loved doing the podcast the last 8 years. Could things have been better and gone better? Sure. Are there things that I didn't bring up? I kind of been mulling over what I've been going to say. And I remember I was going to say something on this podcast, and I was like, that's a good thing to say. I should bring that up and I should say that. And I forgot. I was in my car, so I didn't have a chance to write it down and, just make a little note of it, and I forgot. So, but to all of you that have listened, no matter how long you've been listening, whether you've been listening from the very beginning, whether you've been listening for the last few years, whether you've been listening, this is your first year listening to the podcast. Thank you. And even an early thank you for all those who have just joining us. I wholeheartedly mean that. And here's to the rest of the year. I have stuff planned. Obviously, I will continue to do my reviews and reactions. I'm going to dedicate a month pretty soon in the summer to a certain director, which will make sense when, I bring that up. I have my rewatch series starting up soon. I'm finally going to start doing that. I want to record a couple more episodes, so I can have them, backlogged. When we get to it, I know it's only, it's only February. It's almost the end of February. But I'm going to do spooky season again in October. I'm bringing back the summer movie season preview podcast. So any podcasters out there listening, you can expect a DM in the future about that. Maybe even some people, who I've been on other podcasts with, if you happen to be listening, I'm going to be reaching out to you. So yeah, I'm not slowing down. I got a year planned. Like I mentioned, I got my next wave. I got my other wave in me. So onward with the Movie Pit podcast. Again, thank you for making this possible, and I look forward to talking to some of you and maybe even some collabs. I'm putting that out into the universe. So rate, review, subscribe, follow on the socials. I'm open, guys. I will be happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. Here's to 8 years, and here's to how many other years I got in me for this podcast. See you later, guys.